Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics. Before getting started, we wanted to make a quick announcement. We are happy to share that Toast and Topics is now available on YouTube. We've recently expanded to this new platform to spread our wings a bit outside of the usual podcasting tools and hope to grow our audience base even further with this. So if you're listening to this episode, take a moment to subscribe and like us on our YouTube channel called Toast and Topics.
We'll link that in the episode description. But, before getting into any of this episode further, Sachin, you were in New York City yesterday when an earthquake hit. Are you doing okay?
Yeah, there was indeed an earthquake in New York City. I am definitely okay, but I was in the office around 10:15, 10:20 in the morning and started feeling the building shaking. And at first I thought it was my stomach, I'm always hungry at that time, so I didn't really know what it was, but after a couple minutes, it was very apparent that there was something more than that. So everything's well, fortunately, but we're a little shaken after that.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that you're doing okay. I hope that you were able to get some food in you as well after that. And without further ado, I think we can now get into the topic of this week's episode, where we have a really interesting conversation about standardized testing, which is something that is universally hated upon by students, and fortunately, something that both Sachin and I are many years past.
Yeah, and I mean, thank goodness we're past those days. I still remember grinding for hours in advance of my ACT exam in my junior year of high school. And I remember still that the timing on that was literally so tight that if you sneezed once or twice on any section, you could lose 3 points in your final score.
Yeah, I feel you there.
So the inspiration behind this podcast topic was the recent decision by our very own Dartmouth College to reinstate their standardized test requirement. And that followed suit from Yale and other major universities. Starting in the class of 2025, students who want to be admitted to one of these schools will have to submit some form of standardized test results, such as the SAT, ACT, or subject test scores from advanced placement.
In today's educational landscape, standardized testing plays a central role in determining educational opportunities for millions of students worldwide. But it's an equally controversial topic with two very valid sides to the debate that warrant our attention in this episode. We're going to focus here on the history of standardized testing, and their strengths and weaknesses, and how they are shaping university classes in this day and age. Um, and in particular, as Sachin mentioned, we will focus on the decision by many schools to go test optional, and the possible benefits of that policy. We'll look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of standardized testing more broadly, and then finally consider the implications of some schools removing this test optional policy and starting to require standardized tests once more. So let's jump right in here, Sachin. And I know that you wanted to look a bit at the history of standardized testing for this episode. So if you could break that down for us now, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, sounds good. I figured I would change things up here and try to look a bit more at history. So, we're going to start this story back in 1926 when the SAT, which stands for the Scholastic Aptitude Test, was first administered to college applicants. And at that time, the SAT was seen as a purely egalitarian tool. At the time, the president of Harvard, James Bryant Conant, uh, persuaded other college presidents to adopt the exam to help expand their student bodies beyond just privileged young men from East Coast boarding schools, for example. And so over the second half of the 20th century, there was widespread adoption of both the SAT and the ACT, which stands for the American College Test, as the preferred test choice, with their scores being used to quickly filter through applicants. And by the 1980s, US News had started to use these scores in their very famous college rankings. And so, in short, these tests just became ubiquitous.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's hard to think of college admissions and colleges in general without considering their SAT scores. And of course, these tests proxy scholastic aptitude to some extent, but they're very much also associated with the cachet of colleges and universities across the country. And certainly, I think that there is an incentive for universities to focus on standardized test scores when admitting students.
Yeah, and I think that, I can confidently say that I was guilty of memorizing the US News rankings when researching colleges back in high school, and I'm sure you were too, Ben. So, given the huge emphasis on these somewhat arbitrary rankings and determining the prestige of various universities, I think that many colleges felt somewhat obligated to report high standardized test scores to help them move up in the rankings. And interestingly, by the year 2000, colleges started to see these tests more as a barrier to creating diverse classes. And the reason for this is that they have had noticeable disparities in scores on standardized tests between racial groups and income groups. According to the College Board, an average Asian student scored over 1,200 points on the SAT, and white students scored on average 1,000 points. But Black and Hispanic students on average have scored less than 1,000 points on the SAT. And so a growing number of colleges and universities began to adopt test optional or test flexible admissions policies back in 2010, which allowed applicants to choose whether to submit standardized test scores as part of their application altogether. Um, and so this shift aimed to expand access to higher education for students and to ideally create classes that are more representative of the broader population overall.
Yeah, Sachin, these are great points. And on the disparities that we see in SAT scores across some groups in the United States, I think many have argued that the test itself is biased, such that, some groups may score better than others. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are many inequities that are baked deeply into the fabric of American society, and these tests are often picking up on those as well. But regardless, they showcase a really uncomfortable reality, and as a result of that, it's not all that surprising that test optional policies have accelerated in recent years. In 2005, the University of California system announced plans to eliminate the SAT subject tests and to reduce the weight of the SAT reasoning test in its admission process, which was a significant departure from its previous reliance on SAT scores for admissions to UC campuses. In 2018, the University of Chicago followed suit and adopted a test optional policy. But I would say that the really decisive turning point came in 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic erupted across the world, and it caused substantial disruptions to the typical college admissions process. Just think about how hard it is to even take a test in the midst of a global pandemic, let alone to prepare for such an exam. More than that, the growing body of research on the predictable validity of standardized tests in forecasting college success, combined with pandemic era disruptions that we've already talked about, were really powerfully pushing some schools to make these exams optional in their admissions processes. And so this policy basically became the standard immediately after COVID across nearly all major elite universities, including Brown, Yale, Georgetown, MIT, and Dartmouth.
Yeah, and that's a really good segue to start talking a bit more about how America responded to these new test optional policies and some of the effects that they had. I think that the most immediate consequence of moving towards this test optional system was a jump in applicants. Cornell, for example, was swamped with new applicants. They had roughly 71,000 compared to 50,000 in a typical year. And a lot of that makes sense, right? The whole idea of eliminating tests meant that there was one less barrier, so to speak, to applying to a college. And it encouraged many students to apply when they may not have previously. I think another consequence of this decision was also to create a more diverse applicant pool. U Chicago, when they had implemented that policy, saw 20% more first generation and low income students. And rural admissions also spiked 56%. So, from the perspective of universities, having more prospective students to choose from gave them much more flexibility to prioritize admitting students from a particular geographic region, income bracket, and gender, for example, to build exactly the class that they wanted. But with all that said, I think that the verdict on whether test optional policies created more diverse student bodies is actually mixed, with some studies showing conflicting results as well.
Yeah, and while an increase in applicants is good from the perspective of increasing the supply of potential students and also potentially increasing diversity, it did lead to some major burnout among college admissions officers who were inundated with applications and had, more gray lines with respect to filtering out potentially unqualified applicants due to not having access to their SAT and ACT scores, which provided a very clear metric on how exactly, students were doing in terms of their scholastic aptitude that could be used to compare these students to students in other countries in a way that or students in other parts of the country in a way that it's very difficult to do when looking at something like high school grades, where you can have grading systems that vary significantly based off of where one goes to school. But of course, this is all, subjective for admissions officers. They really can't be expected to know which classes are challenging for students when not looking at applicants from high schools, from schools that they have lots of familiarity with. And then also, somewhat unsurprisingly here, just due to these test optional policies, the number of students sitting for the SAT declined rather significantly. In 2020, immediately before the pandemic hit and schools switched to being test optional, around 2.1 million American students sat for the SAT. In 2021, the year after, only 1.5 million students did. However, even though there was a substantial reduction in the number of American students taking the SAT, for many, the test optional requirements actually felt hollow. Withholding scores to many students felt like an admission of not actually having done well enough to report their scores. And with it being clear that the most competitive scores on the SAT and the ACT would still report. For example, if you got a 35 in a test optional year on the ACT, you'd probably still report that score, even if the school was test optional that you were applying to. I think there was actually a lot of pressure on the students who were submitting their scores to do exceptionally well on these exams. So overall, there were some somewhat negative impacts associated with many universities in the United States switching to these test optional policies.
That makes sense, and it's really interesting. It sort of reminds me of a company giving you unlimited PTO. You know, you get it, but do you really? And in a world where only the top scorers on standardized tests actually submit scores, it's the same sort of dynamic where those who are submitting are really only the ones that have quote unquote good scores. So I think that that warrants us spending a few more minutes actually talking about the case for taking standardized tests in the first place. There was a really interesting article that I read from New York Magazine using MIT as a case study. And MIT was one of the first schools to actually bring back the SAT requirement back in 2022. And they initially faced some very serious pushback from the college admissions community broadly. But this also brought out the case for what these tests accomplish. So, first, standardized tests are shown to be very strong predictors of success at universities. The biggest thing that test optional policies miss are the chances that students actually graduate. Ultimately, these test scores are a necessary benchmark for evaluating how prepared a given applicant is from a high school with varying degrees of rigor. And in the case of MIT, some stats that I found really interesting were that the average first year GPA for members of the freshman class that submitted scores was 3.57, and for non-submitters, it was 3.47. And when test scores were required, the middle 50% of MIT first years scored between 780 and 800 out of a possible 800 on the math section of the SAT. But when they became test optional, roughly a tenth of first years scored between 600 and 699 on the SAT math section. So taking out test scores mean that admissions officers run the risk of admitting students who may not actually be ready for a school's given curriculum. And in the words of the Dean of Admissions of MIT, Stuart Schmill, it's, quote, not just about who comes in the door, but also who goes out. Um, Second is that SATs actually work against grade inflation at America's high schools. And as you mentioned earlier, Ben, every high school has different curricula, different levels of rigor, and different grading policies. So without some standardized test, it's hard for admissions officers to actually make sense of which students have gained the most mastery over important concepts. And so, as we mentioned earlier, there are huge discrepancies in test scores among income brackets, racial demographics, as well, due to differences in privilege. But standardized test scores allow admissions officers to compare apples to apples when making admissions decisions, which may ultimately be the fairest way to look at students.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more there. It's the apples to apples comparison that these standardized tests offer that really does make them quite appealing to admissions officers seeking to understand who might do well at their universities. The other point that I just wanted to touch on here concerns privilege. I think it's often said of the SAT that, one's income and family background has a very heavy weight on the score that they ultimately maintain, because if you come from a wealthy family, you can pay for SAT tutoring, you can devote more hours to studying. These are all things that ultimately can increase one's score, and it does cause a gap between wealthy and non-wealthy students in terms of the scores that they get when taking the SAT. So I think it's completely fair that people come after the SAT from that perspective. At the same time, though, there are so many other ways in which privilege can be baked into the college admissions process. For example, without the SAT, college essays might carry more weight in one's application. But, it's often the case that students will have their parents help with writing these essays. And often those parents, especially if they themselves have gone to good schools or made a fair amount of income over the course of their careers, they will know how to write these essays in a better way than, say, a low income student who doesn't have any help from their parents might be able to. The basic point here is just that there are so many other ways that privilege can show up in a college application, and calling out the SAT for that ignores these many other channels. And I actually think that in some ways, the SAT may be one of the more egalitarian means by which we can identify really high performing students from all sorts of backgrounds. There's one other really interesting point, I think, associated with these colleges switching from test optional policies at this point. And that is that the Supreme Court has struck down affirmative action, which has in the past allowed universities to give more weight to applicants of certain backgrounds in order to create classes that are more representative of the diversity of the United States. Where requiring standardized tests complicates this entire dynamic is that if colleges can no longer, preferentially select members of a certain demographic to be in their university, if they also have SAT scores from members of that demographic, and if those SAT scores differ significantly from members of a group that aren't being treated favorably, these colleges now could be legally liable for basically, admitting students with lower SAT scores from one group while keeping others at kind of an arm's length. And so, in a way, I sympathize with some colleges for being reluctant to reinstate standardized test requirements, just because without them, I think they had a lot more flexibility to make decisions on what their classes ought to look like in a post-affirmative action era.
Yeah, those are all really good points, Ben. So let's conclude this conversation. I think that if we had to sum it up, standardized testing does seem poised to resume the prominent role that it once had in college admissions. And I think that really a conclusion here is that college admissions are hard. It's an art more than it is a science. And I think that it relies on a range of data points to make a decision on any given applicant. And on test score specifically, the back and forth between test optional and non-test optional policies over the years has seemed to only really further cement the power and importance of tests in the admissions process. But in the end, I think that colleges will just have to decide for themselves on what information they need to actually make admissions decisions themselves. But if there's one thing that we've learned, standardized testing will still be in the conversation, and I don't think they'll be going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, Sachin, unfortunately for stressed high schoolers across the country, you're probably right. Standardized tests aren't going anywhere, but I think as we've covered in this conversation, there are a lot of reasons for them to be recommended. So pivoting to next week, we are going to be discussing the recent $15 congestion tax to be imposed on drivers in Lower Manhattan, and at a broader level, the effect that America's auto culture has had on its cities. So join us then. It's going to be a great conversation, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and follow us on the podcasting platform of your choice. And if you didn't like what you heard, please share it with a friend or family member to see if they might feel differently. In any case, we'll be around. See you again next time.